I wanted to hate this video game. The Last of Us 2 was surrounded by a circus of media attention, both positive from mainstream outlets, and even worse, the usual SJW YouTube crowd. That is to say, the anti-SJWs. I went into this video game staring at the title screen and grinning to myself. I hated it before I even interacted with it. I had plans to give it away in disgust once I trudged through the 20 hours of what I thought would be heavy-handed politics, hidden in game form. But what I found shocked me. There's an excellent video game here. One of the best shooting experiences I've ever had in a video game. The violence is visceral and often surprising in just how much fun it could be. Of my few complaints with the game is the hope for a combat trial mode. A selection of challenges based on a point system with curated combat scenarios would keep this game in my limited hard drive space for long after I've finished playing through the story. A potential multiplayer mode rumored to be coming later would also take this game up a point. The combat leaves almost nothing to be desired. It's immediately satisfying and does things purpose-built shooters have had years to get right, and it does it better than them. Headshots produce a bloody spray of gore, with blood hitting the walls behind them with a satisfying splatter. When the enemy is in the open, a spout bursts open from wound as the head snaps back. Allies to these enemies often scream out their name in horror as a comrade is killed. It brings a new element to the violence that games like Max Payne, for example, haven't considered. These aren't just goons working for an evil mastermind or gang leader. These are human beings with relationships, and people who care for them that you are killing. Screams of anguish bring a moment to consider your own survival as well. Whether they are good or bad people, ultimately, your character's survival is what matters most. Though it is an interesting proposition to consider other people's feelings as you conduct the violence. I don't bring up this emotional appeal to killing as an admonition either. If anything, it makes the experience more immersive. And say what you will about my humanity, but it increases the fun. It's nice to know in a zombie apocalypse, killing is black and white at the end of the day. If someone is trying to kill you, the only choice is to kill them first. This is a video game at the end of the day. The only way to progress is to kill, or, if you are crafty enough, sneak past the enemies, which I almost never did in my playthrough. These bastards killed Joel. Why wouldn't I kill them? They're trying to kill me. I understand at the end of the day there's supposed to be a lesson on revenge and an endless cycle of violence. The developers just made it too fun to not engage in killing. They're the biggest perpetrators, and as soon as the multiplayer mode is available, I will be killing real people behind these avatars. Killing is fun. It perhaps does it better than any other video game I've ever played. And if I could recommend the game for any one reason, it would be the killing. It's a seriously fun video game. It runs smoothly. A multiplayer mode is a must. During the promotional lead up to release, there was a lot of talk of the philosophical aspects and challenges to the player. Now I say this with full confidence. If you want to play one of the best third-person shooters of all time, you can safely ignore the story content. It's worth playing the game on its mechanical and technical merits. And that is just shooting humans. As I said, there was a lot of talk of politics and storytelling challenging the player. Well, at the end of the day, the game is still a post-apocalyptic zombie game. The zombies from the first game return. Again, a fresh take due to the fungal infection that, as most know by now, is based on cordyceps. Fungal growth that takes over human beings and creates mushroom zombies that are truly terrifying as a concept. There are the standard freshly infected runner types that mostly look like deranged humans, and the next stage of infection, the clickers. As gameplay elements, the runners are dispatched easily enough. On the normal difficulty I played, they can be snuck through or dispatched if you are patient enough. There are no resource-intensive shivs needed to kill clickers anymore. And Ellie, who equipped with her infinitely durable knife, can kill these creatures by sneaking up on them. It levels the playing field from the first game, in which you needed items every time you wanted to take one of these dudes down. It's a welcome change. It encourages playability and gets past some of the artificial video game limitations of the previous game. It's not completely easy. The clickers are easy to alert, and other fungal zombies during these moments don't stop and allow you to conduct your violence without interruption. At times it may even be worth skipping an infected area when faced with 3 or more of these enemies. Although it's still fun to kill these creatures, you could be easily overwhelmed if you are careless. It's just enough of a challenge to indulge in the power of fantasy without being easy enough to be without stakes. Every encounter will leave you looking for ammo, but not so helpless that you cannot progress. Your character is not as helpless as the first game either. There's a rock, paper, scissors setup to the combat, with the dodge maneuver available. Provided you time it right, you're able to duck and weave as you slash back with your knife as Ellie, or your fists if you're playing as Abby. And you play as both throughout the game. If you aren't able to do that, your gun is available to finish them off quicker. That may be too easy in this sense, but it's all in service of being a fun video game. The higher difficulties most likely have harsher penalties for this approach, and I played on normal, which was an extremely enjoyable and comfortable experience. It's challenging, but never frustrating. There's never an oh come on moment, and it's carelessness or not being observant enough to get killed that makes you restart the combat sections. The pacing is absolutely impeccable as well. Just when you are tired of fighting zombies, there is a nice walk through a peaceful area where you can scavenge for parts and pills, which are used to upgrade weapons and skills. These serve an interesting and manageable upgrade path for weapons and skills, though some can be forgoed entirely. Increased sonic range on the hearing ability is an interesting addition, as well as increased movement speed for the sneaking modes, and a lot of it serves to make the scavenging for items in abandoned houses a fun part of the gameplay as you dodge the clickers and various other enemies throughout. Finding the peaceful moment, just searching for these items and pressing the triangle button to collect them is a fun break from combat. There is a story to tell in the environment. Easy to keep track of a shop that you pick dry of resources. Notes left behind or scrawled on old and dirty paper with some clue to what happened in the particular area. Notes from people who were bitten and realized they wouldn't make it to tell the story of the body you found next to it. Ellie often comments on this, rationalizing that taking the medication left behind by someone intending to get it to his pregnant wife in one instance. She rationalizes that she needed it more than the other person did. This adds a lot of thought to the searching going on between the human combat zones and the zombie sections. Scavenging is a rewardable part of the gameplay loop, and enjoyable. The environments are beautiful. If you took the graph section from the first game and extended it to the entirety of this game, would be a good way to describe The Last of Us 2. There's an increased decay to the buildings, and vegetation is now overgrown as you venture throughout the world. All the areas are inspired and uniquely identifiable. And the world of The Last of Us 2 is as much a character as Ellie and her supporting cast is. There's a story about revenge here, but also a story told about how the people perpetrating this violence have come to live like this. The endless cycle of violence isn't just the worst part of human nature. It's also the transformation of society as told to the new world they live in. Constant reminder of how the world they inhabit is much different from our own. When people have to change how they live to fight for their survival, the cycle of violence becomes a necessary part of life. It's a new world, and holding the people who live in it to a standard of our current times isn't fair. They don't have everything they need, and the chaotic presence of the zombies is a constant threat to life. Could everything be talked out provided resources were rich? Hard to say. There are no options for such a gameplay element, no reasoning or a give up and surrender button. The cycle of violence is part of the gameplay loop. Much like the world Ellie lives in, it's a higher power that forces it on the player. A world created and rules set up by the developers. The cycle of violence is unavoidable, and despite the political approach to the advertising and marketing, the cycle of violence can easily be blamed on the developers. The player, presumably enjoying the game, is trying to advance and survive. There is no blame to be given to them when it's this fun. How else could we advance in the game when we're fighting human zombies in the world due to how the developers set it up? For all the interviews and mass hysteria surrounding the game's release, there is very little SJW politics inside. There is violence and immediate action. There are characters who are fighting to survive and doing what they believe is right. There's perhaps the best shooting system in any video game ever released. If there's politics in this game, it's easy enough to avoid them. There is that much fun to be had in it. What we're left with is an interesting question on SJWs and the art they create. I have come to something of an interesting revelation when it comes to the debate. If the art is executed this well, I am more than willing to hear out the politics of the creators. The art is that important to me. I can't imagine avoiding this game and missing out on the wonderful experience that it became to me. While I'm not necessarily moved by the particular message or story necessarily, I nonetheless appreciate that the developers and creative team believed in it enough to create this game. If all SJW art was this good, my ears are open to their message. The problem with the SJW and the anti-SJW crowd is when the art suffers for the sake of politics. You can't throw a walking simulator together with a message and get me interested in it. What you can do is create a compelling video game, polish the gameplay, and make it a joy to interact with if you want to philosophize at me. If you have a good product or piece of art, you've earned my interest. I won't pass up an opportunity like this again simply due to disagreeing with the political interests of the head developer. For whatever faults I have with this game, I enjoyed playing it. It's not necessarily a message I disagree with it either. Violence and revenge are compelling concepts to base the game around, and while I ultimately lay the blame for it on the world rather than the characters who are living in it, it's a harsh lesson, with consequences that rest on choices, rather than the unchangeable circumstances of birth, such as skin color or gender. While it may be difficult for fans of the first game to agree with the choices here creatively, it's much more than killing off Joel with a golf club. He's present throughout the story in the form of flashbacks, answering questions about him and his climactic choice to save Ellie in the first game. These moments reveal more about the man and the flawed character he was, while wrestling with the pinnacle moment of the first story. He's present and alive during these moments, with a particularly poignant exploration throughout a museum, spending time with Ellie as he sets up a birthday celebration for her. He's not simply killed off and forgotten about. He's alive in Ellie's memory, and a constant driving force as she struggles with his absence. Despite her new love interest in Dina, it's clear the man who saved her in the first game is still important to her, and honored long after he's gone. He's not killed and brutalized to make way for Dina, or for Ellie to take center stage. He's not a victim of SJW politics, but faced with the consequences of the actions he took to save Ellie, and eventually paid for it. Whether it was selfish of him to save Ellie against her will or not is left to everyone experiencing the story. The Last of Us 2 is art before it is politics. It's a fun experience before it is a thought-provoking story, and for anyone passing it up due to the misguided marketing, I encourage you to play it. It's as good as an experience as you're going to get in a modern-day video game. It's fun to play, and immersive in all the best ways. You owe it to yourself to play it through. And that's just the first part of the game, playing as Ellie. At some point during the story, you transition to a new character named Abby. She's the muscular woman who takes over for the second half of the story. She plays slightly differently, forgoing a knife in favor of her fists. She's rough and brutal, and while the animation set for her character is different, you're still playing the same game you've enjoyed up to the halfway mark. You work your way through Abby's story after being left on a cliffhanger with Ellie. The developers purposefully using that particular moment in order to force you into emphasizing with your enemy. This is the same girl who took a golf club to Joel at the beginning, mind you. To say it's risky to put the player in her shoes is an understatement. It's at this point where I began to lose enthusiasm with the game. Not necessarily due to the emotional attachment I was feeling to Joel or one of the other characters, but where the missions went. There's still an incredible amount of set pieces and action sequence to go through as Abby, and they shed a little bit of humanization along the way. If you remember earlier, I mentioned that the names called out by people's friends as you killed them. Well, playing through as Abby, you encountered the same names in different settings. You discover them in cafeterias or patrol routes in the friendly areas you visit as Abby. You have brief conversations with them, and even a dog who's named Bear. It's an interesting way to encourage sympathy for Abby, coming from Ellie's point of view, a character that Ellie has every right to hate. While the first half of the game was engaging and went by excitingly, the second half slows down considerably. You start off with a new set of abilities and a starting arsenal that's much more limited. You no longer have access to one of the more interesting weapons in the bow. Abilities are different enough that it's not an issue. But the momentum and pacing, which were stellar before this, do suffer as a result. This is compounded with the presence of the narratively important trans character, who I'm still not sure what they are. Lev, as they're known when you meet them, is a bald-headed child who is proficient at wielding a bow. As soon as she shows up, the political issues that were avoided enough in the first half come screaming to the front of the line. Abby, who's already a character that the player distrusts, introduces a confusing element to the story. The player doesn't trust her, and her willingness to help someone she just met, while a fine enough video game trope, suddenly pulls Abby into a completely different direction and motivation. We're now on a mission to help Lev and their sister over guilt. As soon as you adventure off with Lev, the enemies misgender them, referring to them as Lily, apparently a dead name, as they open fire on you and your new companion. There's a moment after this battle where Lev offers to explain, and while Abby turns it down, it's nevertheless center stage of the story, which as it continues is not the story of Ellie, and whether it's wrong or not to seek revenge, and it's now a lecture on dead naming and pronouns of a character you just meet. We come to learn Lev shaved their head after being appointed wife of a village of religious zealots. Lev rejects this by shaving their head. Fine enough, but it's an entirely new and unrelated narrative adventure outside the theme of revenge. They wrote a completely different game in the middle of The Last of Us 2. The combat and the action is just as good as it was in Ellie's section, and the environments are as gorgeous or more so than they were in the first half, and get progressively darker as Abby's adventure continues. The weather and raining sections in this part of the game I enjoyed greatly, much more so than the areas that Ellie went through. This element keeps the score from dropping completely, almost as if to make up for the disappointing or lack of story direction in the first half. The standout section of this part of the game is a visit to the ER room that was one of the first centers to handle patients on Outbreak Day, previously hinted at in Ellie's section. Left to the zombies and spores, it's a dark and scary place to venture through, with medical supplies desperately needed at the end of it. It's the most dangerous place in the game, and a welcome surprise is waiting for you at the end. It's a hulking, stalking nightmare that you would expect of a place that was ground zero of Outbreak Day. And the horror waiting down in the basement is well worth the trek. Getting past this section is harder to be enthusiastic about the game as a whole when Lev takes center stage. She's not a great character with very little to define her, and it becomes apparent Abby's story is simply a checklist of tasks centered on helping Lev without motivation, other than guilt that she mentioned when she first went to their rescue. The lesson Abby is supposed to learn is much harder to figure out, and she ends the game helping Lev with an uncertain direction for her own future. Ellie's story, however, ends much better. While you played through the second half as Abby, you finish the story as Ellie. She returns home to the perfect ranch house that her and Dina had teased at the beginning. They had built it up into a very nice and warm home, but when she returns, it's empty. Girlfriend Dina nowhere to be found. Sitting down with the guitar Joel taught her on is the perfect reminder of what she's lost while seeking out her revenge. The 2 missing fingers on her hand that Abby bit off make it hard to play. That's about as poetic an ending as could be asked for. It's a downer ending with nothing positive to look forward to. While this works with the lesson it was trying to teach, that revenge is bad, at the end of the day it's still a video game. I haven't touched it since finishing it a week ago. While I do plan another playthrough, there are no decisions to make, no alternate choices. If this had been one ending with a good one to chase after, it would have been a hell of a game. But as it stands with the single ending, it's more of a lecture. You can play the sections of the game out of order, choosing one at a time if you want to relive the better moments, and it is worth playing through them again. And there is a new game plus if you'd rather just experience the story one more time. This could have been one of the greatest video games of all time, and is dangerously close to it. If more games played as well as this did, I'd never put them down. It plays damn fine, and I encourage anyone to suffer through the Lev of them too, to get to good parts and ignore the story as you find it disagreeable. It's well worth playing this video game. 9 out of 10.